You will discover. That's good to know. Okay. But if you love your enemies, you will discover that at the very root of love is the power of redemption. So this morning, as I look into your eyes and into the eyes of all my brothers in Alabama and all over America and over the world, I say to you, I love you. I would rather die than hate you. And I'm foolish enough to believe that through the power of this love, somewhere, men of the most recalcitrant bent will be transformed, and then we will all be in God's kingdom. The second reading is from James Baldwin. The American writer James Baldwin often talked about innocence when he talked about racism. More specifically, he had this to say, writing in his classic, The Fire Next Time. And this is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. One can be, indeed one must strive to become tough and philosophical concerning destruction and death, for this is what most of mankind has been best at since we have heard of man. But remember, most of mankind is not all of mankind, but it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. I'd like to now introduce our friend, Reverend Bob Tucker. Bob retired after serving the First Congregational Church in Houston for nearly 30 years. We're fortunate that he and his wife, Maggie, usually visit us once a month when Bob inspires us with his wisdom and experiences. He was the senior minister of the First Congregational Church of Houston, also the interim minister at First Unitarian in Houston. He has also served churches in South Dakota, Minnesota, and Kansas. He and Maggie taught several years in Turkey, and he is the Executive Director Emeritus of the Foundation for Contemporary Theology. Please welcome our friend, Reverend Bob Tucker.
It's good to be here on your inaugural Sunday. I was thinking of bringing down a bottle of champagne, but I thought about it after Specs was already closed, and therefore I couldn't do that. Anyway, I've been keeping track of your process over the internet, and I must say I've been quite impressed by the diligence with what you've approached the issue, and also on how you've set it up. So I hope that it works well for all of you and also for all of those on Zoom as well. In fact, I think that Zoom has been one of the godsends, to use that word in a non-literal way, for this particular period. It has not only kept churches connected with each other, but also community organizations. In the early days of coming to Galveston, the scheduling was somewhat chaotic, and it was only when Mary and I worked out that I would come the first Sunday of each month that there was some order. And that works out pretty well, except for the first Sunday of July. It's always either on or near the 4th of July. One would think that perhaps there would be a overlap of issues, but there's so much that goes on in our country and in church-state relations that there always seems to be a new topic. And the topic this time is critical race theory, CRT. At least in the materials that I read on the internet, it is constantly coming forth with people writing about it, complaining or supporting. In order not to lose touch with the real issue of racism in our society, I have two items that I use to always keep in touch. The first one is in the corner of my office, and it's an axe handle. It's a little over a yard in length, a little over a pound. I bought it at one of the hardware stores. And when I look at it, I think of what it was like to get off one of the buses in the South during the Civil Rights era and have a 19-year-old gleefully malevolent looking at my leg or arm or ribs or head and having swinging that at me. It cost to go through that period of time and to achieve a certain amount of development in terms of the racial issues. The other thing I use to use as a trigger to think about racial issues is what I call, have learned to call, America's unholy Trinity. And some of this is maybe a little repetitive because I've said it before, but I haven't put it together in quite this fashion. And the Trinity is lynchings, burnings, and Jim Crowing. First, the lynchings. There is a museum over in Montgomery, Alabama now called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And it has a tribute to all of those who were lynched from 1877 to 1950. There are a little, almost 4,400. And along with that, there are pictures of festive crowds of children let out of school and faces gaping, body parts, fingers, toes, ears, noses, and penises passed out to the lucky recipients. The second part of the unholy Trinity is the burnings of communities. And just a month and a half ago, we were made much more aware of Greenwood, just north of Tulsa. It's the single worst incident of racial violence in America other than the Civil War. There were 150 to 200 people killed in those 2 days. About 10,000 Black people were made homeless. There were $32.5 million in property damage and blocks of burned out homes and businesses. Machine guns were used. Fire bombs were dropped from airplanes. And then in addition, there are a couple of dozen other communities in this country where the community was burned out. And the third part of this unholy Trinity is the Jim Crowing, just the daily, weekly, monthly, yearly indignities of subservience, never raising one's head since one could lose it. It could be lethal to be noticed. What broke the unholy Trinity and the legal structure supporting it was the civil rights movement of the 1960s with the leadership of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. That era ended with King's assassination on April 4th of 1968. And the riots that swept this country also were known as the Holy Week Uprising. There's a reason why we honor King, both as a national holiday and with a statue next to the Washington Mall. But as my graduate school professor said, and I think I've said this before, at the time of the addition of the under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, that we always build monuments to the dead. When was the last time you noticed King and his ideals and the civil rights movement in the public arena? They faded from the active consciousness of contemporary American life. And why did that happen? In my view, it's that we Americans, at least we white Americans, were tired of the daily turmoil on TV. With King's death, we were able to push that aside and listen only to the Vietnam carnage. King may have died, but racial issues did not. And at that time, the time that King was killed, 1 year before, there was a book that came out by a Harvard law professor and who began to use the term institutional racism, or also known as systemic racism. Institutional racism is distinguished from everyday racial bigotry by the existence of institutional policies and practices. For example, individual racism is often identifiable because of its overt nature. We can see it. Institutional racism is less perceptive. One example of institutional racism that I discovered in my reading was the GI Bill of 1946. I always considered the GI Bill a shining example of American enlightened forward-lookingness and its can-do attitude. However, the housing element of that bill, it turns out, was written in such a way that it allowed, even encouraged, segregated housing. So for 75 years now, any government help in building homes has promoted segregation. So government subsidized housing is one aspect of critical race theory. To look at critical race theory clearly, that is outside the turmoil that is taking place today in turmoil in editorials, state legislatures, and schools, I find it helpful to see CRT in 3 stages. First, there's just this plain definition. It really is based on the Marxist idea that societies have a class struggle. And what those who developed CRT did was to move aside the class struggle and put in there for America the racial struggle. So critical race theory is a view of society as being deeply embedded with a pervasive racism, deeply embedded and pervasive. Marxism never took hold really in this country, but what the founders of CRT did was to see a parallel division in this country with racism. As an example of this, consider one commonly known fact. Blacks make up less than 14% of the population of this country, and yet they make up close to 40% of the US prison population. Is it that Blacks are so much more law-breaking? Or is it that the criminal justice network of police, courts, prisons, and laws are pervasively racist? Second, how is this theory used in looking at our society? Well, I've just given one example in the criminal justice system, But CRT sees something that is so deeply woven into the very fabric of this nation that the proposals for reform stretch the mind to exhaustion. What surprises me is that proponents seek to slip over in addressing this to the violence that is going to take place. Conflict is inevitable when you reach into society and begin to say things need to change. One place where that is taking place is again in the criminal justice system. We had the incident up in Minneapolis, and the jury verdict of guilty. And of course, out of that came the whole idea that we're going to defund the police. Well, first of all, there's been a backtracking of that in Minneapolis and Portland, two of the primary cities where protests have taken place. But also what we're seeing is an increase in shootings and crime across the country. And some of that is certainly attributed to the disregard that we now view police. Stemming from the death of George Floyd, there's defund the police, there's Black Lives Matter, and as George Floyd's brother said, all lives matter. And he was highly criticized for that by those in the CRT camp. So there's not just the turmoil of CRT, but it's exaggerated by the deliberate intrusion of this issue into the division between Democrats and Republicans. Michelle Goldberg, a New York Times editorialist, wrote just last month, Christopher Rufo has worked at whipping up the national uproar over critical race theory, tweeted out in March an explanation of how he was redefining the term. And this is what he said, what he was doing. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. He's been pretty successful. And the group that is most attacking critical race theory is Fox News. In less than 4 months, critical race theory was mentioned over 1,300 times. Why? Because critical race theory has become the new boogeyman for people unwilling to acknowledge our country's racist history and how it impacts the present. To understand why critical race theory has become such a flashpoint in this culture, it's important to understand what it is and what it is not. But here are some areas of issues that have come up. Critical race theory views traditional values, morality, and standards as tools for the oppressors that attack by attacking America's founding documents. And one place where that happens is in the 1619 Project of the New York Times. It makes, that particular project makes slavery central to this country. And in doing that, he dethrones the Pilgrims, because this all took place in 1619, 1 year before 1620, and the Declaration of Independence, which refers only to men and whites. Critical race theory also views society as divided into blacks and whites. And this goes back to its dependence on Marxism, and assigns the evils that beset our society to whites. You think about the rhetoric that is now around: white supremacy, white privilege, white accountability, white guilt, white dominance, the weaponization of whiteness, and white fragility. I think the end result of all this can only be a society more divided and more at odds. Another thing that has come up with CRT is a substitution of the word equity for the word equality. What we're trying for in education these days is equity, not equality. We've often said that we are a land of equal opportunity, but equity is asking for the same results for everyone at the end. If math scores are lower for one group than another, then the system has to change in order that the math scores have equity, are equal. Well, in general, blacks do not do as well as whites on math scores. And so that needs to change. But then whites don't do as well as Orientals, and that too has to change so that everyone comes out the same. And that is part of the problem of critical race theory in schools. There's also been a problem in some of the school districts in Montgomery County in Virginia, and also in San Francisco. In San Francisco, they decided that the school board decided that they were going to remove the names of the presidents, Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson on schools, but also remove Robert Louis Stevenson, the Revolutionary War hero Paul Revere, and even a school named for a longtime California senator, Dianne Feinstein. And why? Well, one board member said commented on before the final decision was that if we don't have anything on the calendar, we don't have to have anyone with hurt feelings like that. And the historical figures for whom the 44 schools are named have significantly diminished the opportunities of those among us to the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is a quote by one of the board members. It's a message to our families, our students, and our community. It's not just symbolic, it's a moral message. So board members unanimously voted to remove all these names from schools during the pandemic, but then they unanimously voted to reverse that decision because they got so much blowback from not only parents in the community, but also from the mayor. Critical race theory is also being addressed in the states. 6 states now, and Texas being one of them, have passed legislation that counters critical race theory. Now, Idaho is the only place where that term is actually in the legislation. But what they are doing is to ban the discussion, training, and/or orientation that the U.S. is inherently racist, as well as any discussions about conscious and unconscious bias, privilege, discrimination, and oppression. There's also 20 other states who are considering such legislation. Well, is this what you want in the schools, for the students to be removed from that kind of information. One other place where I see a lot of issues taking place, or CRT is mentioned, and that is in articles. I don't see this a lot in the paper, but I certainly see it on the internet in the editorials I read. Let me tell you, just read a few of the titles of some of the articles. The fight back against critical race theory. Its creators thought America was on their side, but they were wrong. What is behind General Mark Milley's righteous race sermon? Look to the domestic war on terror. The overarching ideology of Pentagon officials is larger military budgets and ongoing permanent war posture. Their new war target explicitly is domestic white rage. What voters are saying about critical theory should have woke educators shaking in their boots. These are just titles from some of the editorials that I read. A poll, majority of Democrats say the US is not a nation with liberty and justice for all. Yes, there really is a war on math in our schools. Do you believe that kids in elementary school should be taught that America is structurally racist and is dominated by white supremacy? Or should they not be taught this? This was a poll, and 39% thought they should be, 61% not. Critical race theory is in such flux, but I don't think there's any determinative way of talking about it or coming to a conclusion. But at least let me share with you some of my feelings about critical race theory, at least as I've read and thought about it. First of all, I think the theory is absolutely correct. I think that America has deep within it a division on race. I think that the racial divide is very deep in this country. There was a reason why so much progress is made in the King era. I think that King touched something in the American culture and it was read earlier before the talk today on nonviolent protest and love of enemy. I don't know if there are enough Christian values alive in our society, enough that a person could come along today and make that appeal for a change in our society. But back then it seemed to have worked. King was a Christian minister and based his philosophy on the actions of love for the other. Critical race theory is based on a different kind of philosophy. Instead of bringing together, it separates. It identifies one group as privileged, another group as unprivileged. One group as having the laws on its side, the other group the laws against it. And if this proceeds, it seems to me that there will be more division in our society. Today's attack on culture is broad. The toppling of statues, the renaming of schools, changes in school curriculum, white math and black math, and cancel culture. The word racist is now a word leveled against anyone who disagrees with these actions. And as I said earlier, even the brother of Floyd was criticized as being racist, even though he's black, because he spoke of all lives matter. To put critical race justice and King side by side, I have two quatrains. The one by Edwin Markham. He drew a circle that shut me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. And I think that symbolizes very much King's approach. CRT, it seems to me, would be fit more into a quatrain of Omar Khayyam. Ah, love, could thou and I with faith conspire to grasp this story scheme of things entire? Would not we shatter it to bit and then remold it nearer the heart's desire? What disturbs me is the shattering to bits. And it seems to me that if we are going to really address the deep-seated racism in our society, we are in for a long, very tumultuous period. And it's a period we have to go through at some point if we're going to be a country that lives up to some of our ideals. The ideals that were expressed in the Declaration of Independence on this particular day. Well, I had a different, or I had an additional part of the title of this sermon, a celebration of country. I want to get a bit theological at this point. We had a Chesterton, an English writer, had quite a way with words. And he also really stunned people at times. He said once that original sin is the most cheerful doctrine. That's not how most people would put it, but I know he's a serious speaker, so I thought about that. And I think it is a cheerful doctrine in the sense that it removes from our lives, either when we look at ourselves, when we look at others, or a political leader, or our country, and we decide that no one is perfect. Even our country is not perfect. Original sin is the most cheerful doctrine. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it remains our country.
Thank you, Bob.